John and I went to Berlin a while ago. What was it? A couple months? No, it's about a month ago to,
About
yeah, go to a conference to learn about ecological psychology a little bit more. And it was very theoretical. But on the journey, both of us were reading a book. I was reading it on Kindle. John, you had it on Kindle as well? Yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah. And the authors today have joined us. So welcome, Julia and Jeff. And we're going to have a conversation. I've got a couple of things I want to ask. I would imagine John's got a couple of things he wants to ask, but it's going to be a very open conversation. So first, Julia, do you want to introduce yourself a little bit so our audience know who you are?
Sure. My name is Dr. Julia Blau, and I got my PhD at the Center for the Ecological Study of Perception and Action, which is at UConn, which is in Connecticut, obviously. I now am an associate professor of psychology at Central Connecticut State University. And my co-author and I, Jeff, we wrote this book together, which has been one of the proudest accomplishments of my life.
That's a big comment. Wait, so you would say the book is more important than the PhD?
I mean, more important is strong. But with the PhD, there's a whole structure around it, and there's things you're expected to do, and there's this was a thing we decided and came up with and did all the work on, and we didn't have to do it. If we didn't finish, nobody would care. If I didn't finish my PhD, people would care. So, yeah, this was a little harder to do than the PhD, I think.
Yeah, that is true. That's understandable. Jeff?
I am Dr. Jeff Wagman. I also got my PhD at the University of Connecticut maybe 5 or 6 years before Julia. And now I am a professor of psychology at Illinois State University, at a university that's about 2 hours south of Chicago, which is a landmark that most people might know.
But you got to tell them the name of the town.
The name of the town is Normal, Illinois.
Normal. Okay, so there's an abnormal one as well, or just?
Well, the real story is that the name comes from normal schools, which are the name of schools that were teacher preparation schools. So my university was founded as a teacher preparation school, and we took on that. So that was a normal school, and then the town got named after the school, and here I am.
Right.
Yeah, but now we get to make all of the jokes.
Yes. We're all for jokes.
Yeah, definitely.
I listened to your episode. I was speaking with Julia briefly beforehand. I listened to your episode with Rob when it first came out almost 10 months ago, Rob Gray. And he asked a question and said, why did you write the book? And I was like, I was going to ask that question. And you said, because someone had to write it. And I thought, that's a good point. So I guess my follow-up to that is, okay, someone had to write it. How do you try and approach people and say, this is the place to start if they're not an undergraduate? Either of you can answer, because I feel like the book from my read is it's layperson, but it's not like really layperson. You still need some intellectual understanding of perception, action to some extent. Undergraduate degree comes to mind, unless you disagree, of course.
Yeah, I mean, the goal was to make it something that a relative layperson could understand. We joked about it. I can't remember what I said on Ray's podcast now. That was almost a year ago, but so I can't remember what of this you've heard, but the goal was to make it something that I could hand to my mother, and then she would understand what I did for a living. Like, it's a joke, but it's not a joke. My mom's a very smart woman. She's got her degree in art, so she understands something from perception, but not as in a scientific way. And she has curiosity. And that was kind of okay, as long as they've got some curiosity and some interest in this topic, theoretically, I could hand them this book and they would understand. That was the goal. Whether we met that goal is, of course, up for debate, but.
I mean, that pretty much sums up my experience. So I have no formal education beyond GCSE.
So you did go to school.
I did go to school, but that's about it. But for me, I had a curiosity and an exceptional interest in psychology and the way the brain works and how we think and all. And I sort of went, yeah, our definition of perception and all of the eye stuff, it doesn't quite match the way that I experience it.
Sure.
but I didn't know why. And it was when Danny and I started having these conversations and he introduced it to me. I'm like, yes, that explains exactly my lived experience in comparison to what is actually being shoved in everybody's faces all of the time.
You,
Sure.
sir, are the target audience.
That's right.
You have succeeded.
Another reason why we wrote the book is because, admittedly, ecological psychology is a niche field. It's, it's not the mainstream. And, most of the foundational readings are really dense.
Yeah.
Dozens and dozens and dozens of pages and logic and philosophy, and it's just hard for a beginning student. And it felt like we're a niche field. We're small enough as it is. Let's try and like ease people into this. Let's get more people on board.
I would argue that some of those readings are hard even for people who are firmly on board. From my own personal experience, but
I certainly take a couple of goes at a couple of the papers. I'm like, I'm gonna have to come back to that one.
yeah. And even the ones that people sort of tout as being the beginning or the primers, you go to read them and you're still finding yourself going, yeah, I got nothing. Like dynamical systems theory, the sort of founding one is this book by Strogatz. And once you already understand what dynamical systems are, you can read that book and understand them even better. But going in with no knowledge, I found myself completely at sea. And to be fair, that was kind of my experience in general with the field. I spent the first several years of grad school. And I mean, I started a little in undergrad because I took sensation and perception with Claudia Carello, who would eventually be both of our advisors, actually. And I started then. But I spent a lot of that beginning time completely at sea, reading those readings and saying, I have no idea what's going on. And it was years and years before I finally figured out enough of the foundation that I started to understand more and more. And then it happened much more rapidly after that. And so part of the reason, I mean, we have a lot of reasons for writing the book, obviously, but part of the reasons I personally wanted to write this was for past Julia, who didn't have that book and sure wished that she had. And so a lot of the feedback we're getting are from grad students, who are just entering the field and have this book as a way to kind of get started. And I'm going, yes. I didn't get to help actual past Julia, but
it's interesting.
Some of those. Sorry.
I was going to say, I didn't actually know that I was learning about ecological psychology when I first was, I guess, taught it. My undergraduate degree, I was exposed to a constraints-led approach to coaching inside of my sports coaching degree. So sure. I went through constraints, went through affordances, how to apply it in environments. Ecological psychology only came to me 2 years after my master's. That's like 5 years after my introduction. And that was listening to Rob Gray talk about it. And I'm thinking,
admit it.
It makes sense now.
That's great.
Some of the dense papers you guys have probably read on ecological psychology were written by Michael Turvey, who is a giant in this field and a fellow Brit. And he teaches an introductory class for the new graduate students in the program that Julia and I came out of. And it is a sink or swim class. And I took the class back when there were paper readings. And there are like meters of like file drawers full of readings. It's legendary how much reading there is in this class. And it really is like, you're just sort of pushed and your job is to figure it out. And I guess with this book, hope this doesn't come off too cutesy, but rather than sink or swim, we wanted to give people the opportunity to float. How about that? We just you can just sort of hang here and rather than trying to make, get to that side or, get to the bottom.
So what would you say is your elevator pitch, as it were, of ecological psychology to someone that isn't as familiar with the field and doesn't want to read reams and reams and reams of paper?
Oh man, we've all had to practice this. This is one of those things to make sure you can do, because when you go out into the field, because as Jeff mentioned, this is such a niche field, you go out and try and get a job, and people will be looking at your thing and go, so ecological psychology, huh? What's that? And so you need like a 30-second version. So we have practiced this a lot. I don't know. My version of this is, well, how, and I do something wherever we are, right? So how I've got this cup here and I know that I can pick up this cup. Well, it turns out that is what we perceive is the way that we can interact with our environments. The classical versions of perception focus more on things like length and width, but we're going to focus on whether or not we can pick up the cup, mostly by putting things back in the context for which we use them. That's what I got.
Okay, it's interesting. You directed straight at perceive, and it was obviously my background comes from education and learning. Yeah. So when I was explaining this in the airport to these ladies that were asking us, because our flight was delayed, obviously, they asked, "Oh, what were we in Berlin for?" We explained, and I went immediately into constraints and affordances. So my approach to the elevator pitch was, I guess, the other side of the. Is it an approach, psychology?
Part of the triangle, right? Perception, action, and cognition is the sort of Mobius strip that but I came in through perception. Sounds like you came in through action. You too, Jeff, right? You came in through the action side or the perception side? Or?
No, I came in through the perception side. And I think the way I would describe it is that we study how it is we perform everyday behaviors, and we do so in a way that links them with any other natural phenomenon. I mean, I think that's how I'd go with it. So it is about, I would describe it in terms of actions, but with an implicit, perceptual guidance of those behaviors.
I like that. That's a good one.
Yeah, I'm curious. How would you? So speaking with John over these episodes, John was firmly in we have a memory store camp and certain tropes from the traditional view, and I didn't like sell him ecological psychology or the approach. I just explained different ways of approaching things, and I gained buy-in over a couple of weeks through a lot of talking. How would you try and suggest, gain buy-in from people that are in the traditional approach, that find a struggle similar to John, right? They find a struggle, there's something not right, they don't know what it is, but there's something not right. How would you introduce them and get some buy-in initially?
Yeah, so my usual approach is to call attention to what you're talking about. That I call it hitting your head on the ceiling, right? So you go in through those traditional approaches, and inevitably they end up hitting their head on the ceiling. There's a point at which they stop being able to explain what we want them to explain, or they stop matching up with our lived experience, or right, they just don't do what we need them to do. And so that's my usual way to start, is by saying, let's actually pick apart your ideas and where you are, and so then, okay, so maybe we try something different. And that's when I take them back. And you've read, I think, the first couple of chapters of our book, essentially in a much shorter version. Those first 4 chapters, that's how I get the buy-in, right? Is sort of saying, okay, carefully, what are your assumptions? Let's see how those assumptions lead to things that don't work. Let's try a new set of assumptions. Here's our assumptions. Here's how I think it works better.
And you mentioned memory and whether or not we have a memory store. I don't deny that we remember stuff. I remembered stuff. I remembered to come to this podcast interview today. I remember what I did yesterday. I remember that Julia and I were at a conference last week in Mexico. But remembering as a process is different than memory as a thing. And I think that is where that's this distinction I would make. Mm-hmm. Because, talking about memory stores, I think really treats the brain and cognitive functions as a computer, as a thing, where there are components that do certain things. And for us, it's more process that there are, yes, I remember, but is there a thing that does that? Well, that's a little different.
And it's also the case that in ecological, we have sort of different definitions for the same term. So like Jeff just pointed out, memory and remembering, it's really very different. I also would argue that in ecological, what we count as a memory might be very different than what someone in a more classical memory store might count as a memory. So the example I always give is, I worked out this morning, so my arms are stronger than they were, right? So now I can lift heavier things. So my body has gone through a semi-permanent change that changes my behavior going forward. So how is that not a memory? Or how is that categorically different than me remembering that I went to Mexico last week? Right? I don't think they are different. Anything that makes a change in the way that you engage with the world going forward is a memory of a kind.
And the other part of this is that in the ecological approach, perception is a process that doesn't have a beginning or an end. And so perception is necessarily directed toward future, perceiving whether you can catch something or pick up an object or walk through a space. But it's also directed at the past. I mean, in approaching that door, I not only know where I can't go, I know where I have been. It's all in the same context. There's no point at which, I guess the issue for me is there's no point at which the present becomes the past. It's hard. You can't pinpoint it. You can do it in a very general sense that, 15 years ago is certainly the past, and 15 years from now is certainly the future. But
where's that
for
line?
for most of our lived experience, it's sort of in this in-between zone where we're just sort of moving through space, and
this has to do with the fact that, in a Gibsonian ecological sense, we don't really perceive time, right? Time is an abstraction that scientists like physicists really need. But in terms of what it is, when we perceive things, we don't really perceive the passage of time. What we perceive are the events that are going on in our lives. And any event is nested within other events, right? So we're doing this interview right now that's nested within the event of my day. But also any event has within it smaller events, right? Nested events that are in it. So like this hand gesture is part of this conversation that we are having. So you see there's this constant interaction or constant nesting of events across all the different timescales. So you can't really say that the thing is in the past until that event is over. And there are ongoing events at all times. So overlapping nested events. So maybe it is that not so much that we remember that thing, is that we're still sort of nested in that event.
Sorry, I guess there's just a long tail on these events that it's hard to, they just sort of go on, and they asymptote, and so they just become the next event. Sorry, John.
John, you were going to say?
Yeah, it's very much like one of the things that Danny explained, and I can't remember that it was recently, but it's very much like the photograph versus the video. It's like taking a snapshot, a photo. A lot of the traditional approach is a photograph. It is captured in time, whereas the ecological approach is very much a video that doesn't end. It's continuous. It never really stops.
So what's interesting there,
cool.
My background is actually that I was a filmmaker. I ran a film company for 10 years before I started in grad school, a little bit of overlap there. And it's interesting because the video camera is actually used as the metaphor for vision for the classical sense of perception, because the way that it does it, even modern cameras take a snapshot, then another snapshot, then another snapshot. So it's a bunch of still shots that are run together. But that is not what we would argue, right? We would argue that there's the time in between, right? We are continuously sampling our environments. So it's even one step further than the video camera. It is full continuous contact rather than a series of snapshots.
I feel like it's I can't remember what article it was. I was reading one recently where they were saying that there isn't an analogy for ecological psychology or something you can use, because most things that we have are machines, and machines inherently have points in time or things that we don't think is quite right. And I'm curious, sort of moving back to memory a little bit, because I was having a I want to say conversation, but the other person's certainly getting heated in the conversation. It's in a YouTube comment section. Yeah. The video is about memory, and the video is about half an hour long about engrams and how engrams store memories as neural activities. And it talks about lots of big words and loads of other complicated stuff that most people go, what? But essentially, he said that memories are stored in engrams. And I asked in the comment section about the environment. How is the environment involved? Because you've obviously separated the organism in the environment according to our 10 commandments or the 6 rules or whatever paper we want to use. you can't separate them.
Do that. Yeah.
So when it comes to the sort of the detection of information that's not anymore, I think that was Vincent that used the example. He was one of the presenters in Berlin. How would you explain that through the learning? I think, Jeff, you did the chapter on it. I haven't read that chapter yet. Dynamical systems bring up metastable attenuation and all these other terms inside of dynamical systems. But what does that actually look like inside of practice? Like, how can I go, well, as a new person to ecological, the approach, how can I go, okay, if memories aren't stored and they're continuous, how do I use that inside of my life, inside of learning, inside of what it is that I do day to day?
I have an off-topic thing I would like to mention while Jeff is pondering that question, which is that the guy who invented the engram, the scientist who came up with the idea, spent his entire career looking for it, right? He cut up a lot of rats' brains, did a lot of lesioning and all that stuff, never found it. And his last act as a scientist was to write an apology letter to the scientific community, recanting the idea of the engram and saying, I don't think it's right, and I think it set us back 50 years. Sorry.
Glad you said that.
Have to say about engrams.
Well, I guess, how would you take this theory that memories aren't stored and use it in your everyday life? Well, if memories are stored, then you don't need to rely on anything outside. Like, why would you make notes for yourself, and why would you keep a calendar? Why would you you'd be interfering, or it would be unnecessary. But if they're not, then all of those things are useful. I think if you recognize that memories are not in a place, that memories are a process, you can facilitate that process by using things outside of you. Yeah, I think this is that knowledge management. Right? The mind as a computer is contained in the skull, and then it stops. And so everything outside is processed, and then there's the processing. I guess if you reject that idea, then you recognize that memories are, continuous outside of you.
And it would rationalize some of the studies that we know about memory, like Elizabeth Loftus's work on how memories can be changed with very small perturbations. You can change someone's memory for an event, or all of the research on flashbulb memories, which turns out are not actually all that accurate and fade just like regular memories, right? If we understand memory as a process, suddenly all of that distortion makes perfect sense because we're distorting it relative to our current self. So all of that makes sense.
I agree. One thing that comes to mind that I know a lot of people would probably come back at you with and come back at me with is, well, forgetting, that's a thing.
Sure.
How would you respond to that? Because obviously...
So we talked a little bit about dynamical systems earlier, and I think that makes a good metaphor for what we would consider about forgetting. So for any viewer who doesn't know what this is, right, the idea is that you can take all of our behavior or cognition or whatever you want and imagine it to be like a sheet. And actually in our book, I describe it as an actual sheet, like a bed sheet. And if you imagine you sort of pull down on the center of that bed sheet and you put a tennis ball in, the tennis ball is going to run towards where you've pulled down, right? So that behavior is at the bottom of a well, making it more likely. And so we call that an attractor, right? Now I can create new wells by pulling down at different places on the sheet. I can also forget things by letting go and having those wells disappear. So that's forgetting. Just because our system is dynamic, I mean, because our system is dynamic, of course, we're going to forget things. That's the only rational response.
John, you're itching to say something.
I was going to say,
Yeah.
John's got ideas.
I'm like, so, and it's on our notes of the next thing, and I cannot wait to go here because we did this over in Berlin, and it was such a conversation stopper. It was great. So this is gonna be great for the podcast. So I am diagnosed with a neurological developmental disorder, ASD.
Mm-hmm.
However, when you look at that for an eco lens, it doesn't make sense anymore. Which is what has been my experience as someone who is diagnosed as, you know, the label that is used popularly is neurodiverse.
Right.
Except when you look at it, or at least from my perspective, from an ecological lens, the idea of, you know, I have reduced working memory, all of that just stops making sense. And although the experiences, and I'm not denying and never will deny that the experiences aren't real, because, oh my gosh, yes, they are. From an ecological perspective, it's quite fascinating for me. And it was when I first uncovered it, me and Danny had a massive discussion about this. And I was like, no, but this. And I'm like, oh, darn, yeah. So now what? And where I got to was it's about adapting the environment to suit where I'm at, which
Sure.
is what I'm slightly obsessed with now.
Sure.
Funny that. And I'd love to get kind of both of your takes on neurodiversity and all of that wonderful stuff.
Absolutely.
Technical term there.
Jeff, you want to take this one?
I guess it depends on how you think about neurodiversity. We call it neurodiversity, and so we're relying on, we're putting it in the brain. But it's probably more than that, and it's probably, I mean, not more than that. I mean that well, the pluses and minuses that come with neurodiversity are about detecting and exploiting information. One of the ways that people talk about ASD in our area, so the way that they've studied it, you guys may or may not be familiar with studies on coordination, where people sit next to each other in rocking chairs, and they sort of it turns out they, under some circumstances, they end up rocking together. When they have studied people, mostly children with ASD, right?
Yeah.
They have shown that the children with ASD don't quite couple with other people as well. And they describe this not by going to the brain, but by saying, well, this looks like a difficulty in attuning to the rhythms of your surroundings, right? So it's about detecting and exploiting information. Now, you know, there's a role for the brain in that,
right?
But so, you know, I think you're sort of asking about the role of the brain in everyday life, especially in the case of neurodivergence.
Yeah.
And the brain does stuff, and if there are differences in aspects of how the brain works, it's possibly going to affect our ability to perceive and act. But the brain is only like a part of of this process.
And a lot of what's spoken about and what's shared online, because I'm in the online space a lot, is about, oh, the reason why I can't do things is because my brain, I have limited working memory. I have all of these problems with my brain which stop me from doing things, which for my reaction was just like, yeah, but it's that, yeah, but one, that let's make the assumption that that is true. One, that kind of sucks because there's nothing you can do about it. And yet people who are ASD, ADHD, all of these conditions are able to figure something out. So how do we figure that out? And I think as I explored an ecological approach, I suppose, ecological approach to neurodiversity, it's like, oh, I'm just it
just
unlocked, I suppose, something for me of moving away from the it's not quite the right term, it's the best I've got right now, the victim mentality of,
yeah.
oh no, I am this label, this thing, which automatically adds a bunch of assumptions and allows me to go, okay, cool. These are things I struggle with. And as Danny and I have explored, of like separating what's actually happening from the brain and moving it into a like, okay, cool, these are things. These are points of a system. These are components of a dynamical system that I'm exploring. And it changes the relationship. At least that's been my experience versus that victimhood, if you want to call it that, that is often portrayed in the traditional world.
When you what you're talking about there is very much the difference between a systems approach and a machine metaphor, right?
Yeah.
In a machine metaphor, ASD is always going to be a broken part, right? Yeah. A malformed part. That means the machine can't function normally, right? And I'm putting air quotes there because I hate that word because yes, there's like a group of experiences that are typical, but that doesn't mean that other experiences aren't like good. It's just different. So I'm going to move this to a slightly different arena for an example, and then I'm come right back. There's this movement disorder. I'm going to absolutely forget what it is. Maybe Jeff, you can help me here, where the people who have it, one of the symptoms is that they walk on their toes because their Achilles tendon is too tight. Anybody know what I'm talking about?
I know of it, but I can't remember the name of it. Someone in my trampoline squad had it.
Well, one of the things they would do in order to, again, heavy air quotes, correct this, was to sever the Achilles tendon, right? So that their foot would then get flat on the ground and then they could walk normal, right? But what would end up happening for those people is that they wouldn't. They would have so much difficulty walking in this new, because they had rearranged their dynamics around their own bodily constraints. And it turned out that walking the way they were walking required less effort by a considerable amount than trying to walk now flat-footed. Even though it looked more typical, it was more effortful. And so, right, the question becomes, is our goal with somebody who has ASD to try and make them look like everybody else? Or is our goal to make that person able to do their thing with the least amount of effort, right? And so this is, when I think of things like ASD, or, I have obsessive compulsive disorder, right? So I've got my own set of, when I think about those things, I tend to think about them as just a different set of constraints. And it's not like the Achilles tendon thing where it's an obvious set of constraints, but it is some other set of constraints that changes the way that I interact with my environment and what it affords for me and what I need to do to rearrange my environment to make the thing I arrange myself as a happy thing. So I guess that's sort of my short version, my much longer version on my thoughts on the
it's interesting. It's interesting you say that. So obviously, I've said my introduction was through constraints. Through the Berlin conference, constraints was not mentioned at all. It was very theoretical, dynamical systems theory, lots of maths and symbols and physics, with affordances. Affordances discussed a lot, but when it comes to practical application, I see constraints as much more useful and tangible for people to grasp and actually apply in real life situations. And through the conversations with John, I haven't been formally diagnosed, but lots of people have mentioned that I potentially have ADHD for various reasons. You giggle, I assume you also agree potentially.
Not me so much as literally everyone in my life.
I actually have ADHD, so.
I mean, just literally everyone in my life.
Yeah.
It's one of those things that I feel it's online, it's very popular. And from my experience with a lot of people inside of my life, not online, when they have ADHD, they use it as an excuse a lot of the time. They say, I can't do this because my brain won't work, or I have ADHD, so I can't do this. Or they use ADHD as this thing, as this crutch, sometimes, from my experience, rather than looking at what the actual environment holds. When I discussed this with John, I was saying that inside of university, obviously being half deaf and half blind, well, I wasn't half blind at that point, but being half deaf, I couldn't sit on the left side of the room because I couldn't hear. So I sat on the right side of the room. I knew that if I took notes, I wouldn't be able to hear what's going on because I can't hear. So I didn't bother taking notes. I just watched, and in my head, I was thinking about other things that were sort of related. So I changed the way that I interacted with the environment to suit the affordances that I physically had as an organism. And when I explained this to John was like, huh.
Yeah, that was literally my reaction. It literally was, huh, well. And so for context, I'm in the business world, whatever that means, very small business, kind of small entrepreneurs, like nothing too big. And a lot of the conversations right now is bringing ADHD and autism and adapting your business to suit the way that you work. But they're talking about it from the lens of this person is bad, people who are neurotypical. And then there's this like versus mentality of like us v them, which obviously, that's what happens. But it's
sorry. One of the ways in which ADHD manifests itself in me is the wanting to say something, and so the blurting and the interrupting. So there you go. I will give you a success story about neurodivergence. Julia mentioned that she has OCD. I have ADHD, and one of, I think, probably the blending of the two is what birthed our book, because ADHD does not it does not allow me to be a detail guy. I'm not a detail guy. I've never read, before I was diagnosed, I knew I was not a detail guy. It just was not. But I can see the horizon, right? I can see the big pictures.
If you let me, I'll drown in the details. Yet there's a long-term plan. So we worked well together, I think.
But that's the other thing about neurodivergence. Neurodivergence, Julia and I have each talked about it as, there are some things I don't do as well, but I feel like I have some superpowers.
Yeah.
In a, superpowers in that I think it has helped me to be a successful scientist. I say this to people and they don't believe me, but it's really, to me, my ability to sort of get out of the details and connect the bigger ideas and see relationships and kind of, because I'm always thinking and I can't stop myself from thinking, I have ideas all over the place. And then I just, okay, well, good, you got these ideas. Let's try and let's get them corralled. That's harder for me. But once I do that, then I'm off and running.
This is exactly right. It's what I was saying earlier. If your goal is to make somebody look like the typical, then of course people are going to look like a broken part. But you're not. You're a system that has arranged itself to survive in the world that you are in. And that means that you're surviving in an interesting way. And that interesting way might get you through a problem that no one else could get through. And I feel like it's my superpower.
It's interesting. When I think of the examples you gave, in my head, the words that come to mind are affordances, expertise, attunement. Like some people have, like the organism, they attune to certain things better for whatever reason due to expertise than others. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I don't think it's a good thing. I just think it's an observation.
Sure.
And when I hear neurodiverse, the immediate question that comes to mind, this is a little bit of like the stats person in me. I don't like stats, or I didn't at university, but typical is a very statistical word. You look at the typical relations and you think, okay. And when I hear neurodiverse, I think sample size. What sample are you looking at? And the example I gave John, which I know is quite crude and is very manipulative with stats, but if you have a room of 100 people and 99 of them are neurodiverse and one of them's neurotypical, which one's the neurodiverse and which one's the neurotypical in that scenario?
Sure.
And a lot of people are like, well, Because there isn't really there's not an answer to that, because it changes constantly with the environments that you're in.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't say each person with ADHD is the same either. So
Not at all. There's
Not
a
at all.
saying among people who treat people with ADHD, and especially among people who treat people with ASD, if you know one person with ASD, you know one person with
Yeah.
ASD. The collection of strengths and deficits differs across everybody.
But that's
And-
true of everybody.
Yes.
This thing, even people who are neurotypical, they have their strengths and their weaknesses and things that they are better at than everybody else and things they're terrible at. Like, I will always be a terrible speller. There's no coming back from that for me. But I also can keep track of 100 things in my head. So, we all have, everybody is like that. So just saying that experience is somehow privileged, or this one is less privileged just because it looks different, I get very frustrated by that. I mean, and of course here we're talking about a series of degrees, because it is the case that autism is a spectrum, and there are some who are not capable of doing certain things like talking, right? And that does ultimately cause problems in trying to succeed in life. But you don't know what that person's inner experience is like. Who knows? And so I'm loath to kind of say, okay, well, here's the line, and woe betide you if you're on the other side of it.
I feel like the again, coming to my mind's eye, or whatever word you want to use, is the relationship between the organism and the environment. If the organism, i.e. the person, is in an environment that they can thrive in, I think it does well, typically. But if the organism is in an environment that they would struggle with, they don't have the expertise to focus or attune to the affordances in that environment, then they will need to expend a certain amount of energy. And thinking of dynamical systems here, they will need to expend a certain amount of energy to maintain that system. And if they don't expend the energy, then the system, the organization, entropies, decays, which means that organization, self-organization, the ability for a person to focus at school disappears, and they've got to do something else. And that, to me, is where, again, coming back to educational systems, I don't think the neurodiverse or the ADHD boy running around in class is the problem. I would say it's the relationship between the environment, i.e. the school environment, and the organism. That's where there is potential issues or conflicts, which is my personal view out there. I don't know whether you have any thoughts.
I mean, I agree.
Okay.
I think it would be sort of impossible to say it was all in one or all in the other, because of course it's going to be the interaction between the two. If somebody's got ADHD, they can sit and focus and play video games for hours and not move. So it's not necessarily the case that it's the person plus environment, system. So anyway.
And something you mentioned, like, everybody is slightly different. Everyone, whatever label. And when you say that in neurodiverse spaces, the reaction is visceral normally. But in this context, because we've added all of this actual context and nuance, it's like, oh yeah, no, that's actually what you're trying to say. But often none of that context is given. It's like, oh, everybody's a little bit autistic, or everybody's a little bit this. But what you're actually saying is everybody has a unique set of constraints and a unique set of affordances that apply in the environment that they're in, and the environment influences that, and that influence. But because this conversation is so rare, I would say, at least in the spaces that I'm in, it's like all of that beautiful nuance, and like, they're right, but also they're missing this context. Here's the context. Here is this. Because once you see this, and when I have conversations with people in person about this, it's like, oh yeah, obviously. It's like, yes, obviously. We don't talk about it. So nobody, we're just in this war zone the entire time. Slight dramatization. It depends on what area of the internet you're in. But
I think the difference, though, is we have language to use to explain what it is that we're feeling. We have affordances, we have constraints, we have information, direct perception, dynamical systems. We have words that we can use to explain these experiences that we're having, organism, environment. Whereas those in the traditional approach have words like cognitive load theory and memory, which they're words, don't get me wrong, they're concepts, but they don't explain the experience, as John said to start with, which...
I was going to say, this goes back to the thing that we were talking about sort of back at the beginning, which was you find yourself in that machine model and classical, you hit your head on the ceiling. You hit your head on the ceiling when those words don't describe your experience. You hit your head on the ceiling when you can't explain what you were trying to say about your own neurodiversity in a way that makes any sense. And you hit your head on the ceiling when you try and say, okay, well, I'm just going to change my environment and that will make it easier for me. That doesn't allow for that, right? So this is what I mean. You hit your head on the ceiling over there. So come over here to the ecological side.
Come to the dark side. We have cookies. As long as you can perceive them.
I wasn't sure if you were going to go with the jokes, but okay, John.
Oh, I am.
Always going to go with the jokes. Oh, you were talking to him. Yeah.
When we were in Berlin, we were joking. Both of us would understand the jokes, but anyone outside of the conversation of ecological psychology were like, what are they talking about? So we would joke about memory stores and affordances, attunement, and we would emphasize those words in certain contexts, and we found it amusing. So
feel free to hand out my book to anybody, just...
I mean, mine's on Kindle, and I don't really want to hand out my Kindle, but
no.
we'll certainly leave a link to it.
Yeah.
I'm curious, Jeff, I mentioned mind's eye earlier. I think it was Jeff that wrote the chapter. I'm not sure, maybe wrong. So I'll open it up to both if not.
That's fine.
When it comes to visualization speeds of perceiving information, Andrew Huberman, if you're not familiar, is a guy on YouTube and podcast that talks about the visual system a lot. And that's where he's done his research. And he speaks about visual speeds and the mind's eye. So there's a visual eye, so you're actually looking around and things with your eye, but then when you're thinking, it's the mind's eye. So what you're perceiving in your head is not the same as what you're perceiving through your actual eyes, and that's how he describes it in explanation, the way that you're thinking about things. And I was curious how you would approach the things that we have in our head. So when I'm thinking about something, but I'm not seeing it, but some people would describe it as they're seeing it in their mind's eye. What's your approaches to that?
Well, yeah, those are issues that are not traditionally handled by ecological psychology, but
that's why I posed the question.
Yeah, no, and
Yeah.
it's a question that needs to be asked. I'm going to punt to Julia for a second, and while I ponder this.
I mean, I guess I would say that it's sort of a question we've already... I'd say two things. One, it's a question ill-posed, right? Because it assumes from the beginning that there are representations in the brain and then asks us to explain them. But the second thing I would say is that there is this experience of like closing your eyes and imagining something, and you can see it, in your head or whatever. And I would argue that that's in no way different from remembering something. And we already talked about what remembering is, right? So I'm going to sort of punt to past Jeff and say, we already talked about that because it's real. I don't see how that was in any way different from remembering something. I think the big important thing for the ecological perspective is that that mind's eye. Okay, so the classical view of perception is that you do that, right? You see the thing with your eye, and then the back of your retina takes a picture. And that retina picture gets sent to your brain. And now you have a retina picture in your like theater, and your inner central executive is like watching that theater and trying to make sense of the outside world, right? So I don't agree with any of that. And like from the beginning. So the eye isn't really shaped like that, doesn't really build like that. The retina doesn't really have the ability to take a picture, even if it's not flat. It's only flat when you make it flat with surgery. It is a mesh of lots of different, it doesn't make a picture back there. You can't do that. This idea that then we would have something inside of our heads watching that picture is like nonsensical to me for any number of reasons, all of which we talk about in the book. And so the big point is that you don't need that mind's eye picture to perceive the world. So even if you can bring something to mind, it doesn't mean that you are bringing something to mind in order to perceive it like that, right? That's, I think, a big difference between whoever that guy is and me.
I'm exactly the same. That's what came to my mind, and I was curious to see if we were thinking the same things.
Yeah.
Right.
And the other thing I would add to that is that I think we always need to keep in mind that so perceiving is a relationship between it's a knowing relationship between an animal and an environment.
Yeah.
Right. So the animal and environment relate to one another in a particular way that results in perceiving, and perceiving is knowing. Right. Perceiving is an epistemic relationship between animal and environment.
Yes.
And so is thinking. I mean, like it's perceiving. I guess the issue is, just like we were talking about before, is there a line between perceiving and thinking, and between perceiving and remembering? And so perceiving is knowing. It results in knowledge, and thinking is just
more
a
knowing.
Continued relationship, yeah, with that knowledge, and thinking. The mind's eye thing, and I guess what I don't like about that is it treats thinking as an isolated phenomenon. It's this thing that happens in this empty arena, and you sort of conjure. It's almost like using a Ouija board. I don't know if they call them Ouija boards in the UK, but it's like, you're sort of, okay, let me conjure up an image of this, and here it comes. But thinking is first off, it's a relationship between animal and environment. It's also embodied. It's also embedded. Thinking is an active process that involves, and it's connected with moving in the same way that perceiving is connected with moving.
I was going to say, I've heard cognizing as a term used quite a lot in the ecological approach. So
we've gotten some, this is our subtitle, right? It's the Introduction to Ecological Psychology, a lawful approach to perceiving, acting, and cognizing. And from people outside of our field who have been interviewing us, we get a lot of questions about this, because of course it is an entirely made up word, but and thinking is right there. So you think, but there's absolutely intended to be bringing up exactly what Jeff was talking about, that this is supposed to be a process, just like perceiving is a process, just like thinking is a process, or just like acting is a process. These are not outcomes. They're not finished. This is an ongoing thing, always.
Yeah,
one of the other points that we make in our book is we talk about the continuity of those processes, that they're not separate boxes. And so this, when we started this conversation about the sensory store, which is its own box, and then there's these different boxes and the arrows, and so what the ecological approach does is just sort of takes those boxes away. There are no boxes, and so there's a continuity of this process, and the continuity of this process is not only within the head; it goes outside of the head. Like, it's a system that involves the animal and the environment. So, I think, and this is what Julie was getting at before, some of these questions are just ill-posed from this perspective. We can't, they don't make sense.
Yeah.
It is hurting me to ask the questions.
Yeah.
No, it's fine. These are good. These are questions that need to be discussed.
And they're
from
questions
this
we get
perspective.
asked. We get asked frequently. We as ecological psychologists get asked those questions. And so getting a chance to be like, well, hang on, is that really the question? And I think this was the genius of Gibson, and we talk about Gibson a lot in the book. He's their founder of our field. This was the genius of Gibson, is that he didn't try and come up with new answers to the old questions. He questioned the questions themselves.
Yeah.
He fundamentally were asking the wrong thing. We need to start over and ask different questions. And so I'm all for, give me those questions that people ask, because then I get a chance to say, that's the wrong question. You hit your head on the ceiling when you try and answer that one. go somewhere
Well,
else.
I know John's got a question, but before he poses it, I like
Yeah.
Andrew Wilson's phrasing of verbing nouns and rephrasing the way that we approach questions and just answering things in general from an ecological lens. It's not a thing, i.e. a noun. Verbing is a process. It's a doing word. I read that years ago, and I keep coming back to it. So,
Every time.
John, you have a question?
So this was something that Jeff has been saying throughout around like how niche ecological psychology is. And one of the kind of conversations that we were having in Berlin was, is ecological psychology a thing, or is it an ecological approach to X? From, I think, my perspective, it is very much an ecological approach to X, to psychology, to thinking, to learning, to like
Optics, haptics, etc.
all of the lovely things.
Oh, I personally think it's absolutely a lens, mainly because anytime I tell somebody about what I do and I get into enough detail on it, it doesn't matter what they do, whatever their thing is, whatever they're interested in, they start going, that relates to what I do. That changes the way that I think about, like I explained it all to my mom and she goes, I'm going to make completely different art now. And she does. I explained it to a friend of mine in clinical psychology and she was like, I think I'm going to approach clinical differently. I explained it to a person who does taxes for a living. And he was like, I think I can redesign the way that I approach taxes with my clients. Right? It's everywhere. It's an approach. That's what I think.
Yeah.
I don't know.
And this is a debate within ecological psychology. I guess I landed on that phrase, but whether we should think about it as the ecological approach to, and whether ecological psychology is too narrow.
Right.
Frankly, it's unfortunate that Gibson, who developed this approach, used the term, and he made a few unfortunate choices in terminology that have created a whole lot of confusion. One is the ecological bit, because
now people think of recycling.
Yeah,
people don't get but in his defense, he was talking about the fundamental unit of analysis is a relation between animal and environment, and that's ecology. And so, on the one hand, it makes perfect sense. On the other hand, it makes no sense. And the other term that he used that already had a meaning was information, and he did not mean data, and that caused problems too. So
Still does. Even for people in our field who find themselves even just in that beginning stages when you're trying to sort through and understand in that pile of papers and you're going, wait a minute, information is being used in 7 different ways.
Yeah.
Which is it? Oh no, it's all of them. Sorry.
There's Miguel, I think, quite recently published a paper about affordances and affordances being used in a variety of different ways. So I certainly think that inside the ecological field, there are lots of words that people are not necessarily misinterpreting, but they're interpreting in their own way through their own lens and then applying it in a way that wasn't necessarily intended, which is muddying the waters even more than it already is, which I certainly don't think helps. And moving sort of backwards a little bit to the ecological thing, my sister is studying zoology, and when I said ecology, she has a completely different mind's eye thought process about ecology. She's thinking now ecosystems with animals like fish in the water. I'm not thinking that. It's drastically different. So I think those words used can be confusing. And I was listening to an old lecture from Harry Heft. I think it's 9, maybe 10 years old on YouTube. I've got it in my notes, so I can find it. But he was at the start of the presentation, he said Gibson was unfortunate in the way that he named it, because there were 3 prominent views of the ecological psychology at the time. Yep. And he was saying, I'm not talking about this one or this one, I'm talking about this one.
That's frustrating. And exactly that experience you're talking about, where you try and tell somebody about it and they go off into whatever their definition of ecological is. And this is always the problem with words, and making sure that we have some agreed upon definition. And if we don't agree, then the word isn't doing its job. And I remember vividly huge SWOT. So we told you about those 2 classes that we had to take with Michael Turvey I still have flashbacks, but I have these vivid memories of him.
Stored in your memory, of course.
Right. However, we're going to define it. I have these vivid memories of him trying to talk about definitions and why it's so important. And my, first year grad student self being like, right, but I'm just trying to make it through the readings this week. And but he was right. Those definitions keep us from communicating with each other and keep us communicating past each other. And that's not always great.
And that's why those dense readings are so dense, because that's what people like Michael Turvey and Bob Shaw, Bill Mace, and Ed Reed tried to do. They tried to take the sort of confusion that Gibson created unintentionally and it really get sharp. But but doing that required lots of nuance, and that nuance, formalization, and so it just got very dense. And so I think the pendulum kind of swung in the other direction. And I guess we're trying to get the pendulum a little bit more centered.
Yeah.
Guy, the guy that ran the Berlin workshop, it was in the beer garden afterwards, obviously best place for conversations. And he was discussing how in the ecological approach, or all of the papers published, there's normally a section that says, this is our approach. It's like section 2 of the article. It's like, this is our approach, to try and get rid of all the assumptions or remove as many as possible. Whereas the other articles, they don't do that. They just start. they don't need that sort of preface. They don't need this preface of, this is what we're talking about. We're not talking about any of these things. And it's almost like an added burden on the ecological academics. They're sort of saying, we're not speaking about this stuff, we're speaking about this. But from what Rob Gray and some of the other people that he's mentioned on his podcast and other podcasts with academics publishing in this area is, for whatever reason, we seem to be questioned much heavier than traditional scientists, which I find really interesting now that I'm out of academia. Really interesting, because I would imagine they should be critiquing themselves the same, but it doesn't seem to level out.
Well, that would require them to revisit some assumptions, and that is always very difficult because everything you do is built on those assumptions. But it's interesting though, because I've talked to other people who are in perception that are not ecological, people who teach sensation and perception. And one of the things that I've seen is that they just aren't thinking about the philosophical background that they're working in, right? If you ask them, because I do are you a computational, or are you Gibsonian, or are you like, what is your overarching theory? And they will look at me blankly, right? Where they'll say, I don't even know who you're talking about. And like, okay, well, maybe I'm using different names than so I'll try and explain it. No, they still don't. They're just, they're going out a lot of the time like theory free. And so that is, I think, why the ecological approach ends up doing that little, as you point, like the little disclaimer box, right? Because you can't go at our stuff theory free. You have to be going at it with, okay, this is what we're looking for and why. So pay attention, because we're going to find it, because we're right.
My wife is a memory researcher. We had stayed married for 15 years.
Congratulations.
No, and she is a theoretical. So she'll, whatever her data, whatever theory best fits her data, that's what she'll describe in the paper that she writes. And I see value in that. In some ways, that's a purer way to do science, because you're like, well, this is the data, and the data, fit this theory. Well, that's what I'm going to lean to that theory. But ecological psychology is a meta theory, right? It's a theory about theories. And so you can't really do that. You can't, and you're never going to do the experiment that proves ecological psychology either. You just have to, there are certain assumptions that we think are better assumptions than the other assumptions, and we think that they're going to do a better job at revealing how animals perform everyday behavior, and that's where we start, and that's where we go. And so you just can't, it doesn't work to sort of I don't know, cut and paste. It doesn't, you had, and then, this is both the greatest strength of the ecological approach and maybe its biggest flaw, that you have to accept the whole deal or none of it.
That's certainly something from the coaching field that I've seen and experienced myself when I was coming out of my master's in strength and conditioning, going into environments. They would take parts of direct perception, but then also use indirect perception, and saying, it doesn't work like that. You either accept it or you don't. It can't be a mix of the two.
Yeah. These are incompatible.
Yeah. I guess jumping into the deep end quite a bit with the free energy principle. I was listening to a conversation. It was a presentation, Zoom presentation, where they were discussing the free energy principle and trying to use that not necessarily as a replacement for dynamical systems theory, but another way of explaining it. Because what the presentation was discussing is that the FEP has been applied with Bayesian statistics and computational information a lot. And that's actually, according to Carl Friston anyway, in this conversation, not accurate. It's other people's interpretation of what he meant. And when he was in this conversation, I was like, oh, okay, I have to reassess my thoughts on this, because he was very pro embodied cognition and pro systems. And he was saying that potentially the free energy principle is supported or can support the ecological approach more than the computational one. Andrew Wilson and him spoke backwards and forwards. So I don't know how familiar you are with FEP, but what are your...
Not at all. I'm completely lost on this. Could you give me like the 30-second elevator pitch? Maybe I just know it is something else.
Yeah. So the free energy principle is essentially a way of explaining systems through physics. So the idea is that you have a system, and the boundary of the system is called a Markov blanket, and the systems interact, but they entropy into the environment. And in order for a system to maintain itself, obviously it needs to use up energy, and the free energy principle suggests that the energy that's free, that isn't being used at the time, maintains the system. So if it tries to look at predictability, unpredictability, and what was it? I can't remember the other word for it, but it looks at those sorts of things and describes the system entropy through free energy. That's really poor explanation, because I need to work on explaining that better. But yeah, it's really complicated.
It sounds an awful lot like when we talk about systems that are self-organizing according to principles of thermodynamics.
Yeah.
I think it's more, I have heard this being coupled with active inference.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's more about, I think it's less about thermodynamics and more about like thinking of making active inferences about how to sustain the system.
Okay.
Is that right?
That's where the conversation went. So there were disputes during this Zoom call about the relationship between thermodynamics, active inference, and the free energy principle as three separate things that they tried to tie in together. I was a beginner in that conversation. Some of them used physics that goes far beyond me. I guess to semi-quote Andrew Wilson, I'm going to trust you on the maths because I'm a psychologist. So I just trusted them with the physics and the maths, because that went way over my head. But it was interesting to hear them talk about the free energy principle as a way of explaining systems. And active inference is something that was just attached to the free energy principle, and Bayesian statistics and Bayesian probabilities and all that stuff was attached to it as a way to use. And I was curious to get your thoughts, but
I do not know enough about this to have thoughts, except for to say that it sounds kind of like the self-organizing principles, but maybe on a 90-degree angle. I
think that's fair.
There's a couple of chapters at the end of the book that deal with self-organization, that deal with thermodynamics as an explanation for, in that case, evolution, but these same principles could be applied to the self-organization chapters, and also on intelligence and life. And I think those chapters will touch on what you're talking about, although I I don't know the principles, so I'm not positive, but maybe you should read them and tell me if I'm right, that those are touching on that, but I'm not sure. Sorry.
It's a work in progress. It's a process. It's not an end, you see.
Right. I'm a process. We're all a process.
Exactly. Is there anything else, John, if you've got another question you're burning to ask?
Less burning, but
Yes,
it
then.
kind of linked to this of like, one thing I really liked about the structure of the book, and I think Danny and I have actually spoken about this, is you're linking to later chapters at all times and then linking back again. And often in the books that the general population books that are read, it's very much from beginning to end.
Mm-hmm.
And it's quite interesting for me as I was reading it, like, oh, go to this chapter to talk about it more. I'm like, all right. And I went to that chapter to go and play more. And then I came back again, and then I moved forward again. And it was one of the I suppose the resistances I had when I just had it in my Kindle was like reading it page by page and page by page versus jumping around inside this, I suppose, dynamic system that was the book, which is also quite hard because it's constrained by the fact you've published it. It's done.
Yeah, it's
and
done.
So how I think there's like 8 questions in there at the same time. 1, yay, that was really good. And 2, how did you, when creating the book, how did you figure out when to stop? I know that Jeff was talking earlier about so many ideas. How did you put the bookends in? And apologies if you've already answered this, but
no, Jeff very early on in the process said to me a phrase I have now come to live by, which is perfect is the enemy of done. And if it were up to me and me alone, I would work on this book for the rest of my life and never stop. Because like you said, it's, there's always more to say. There's always better ways to say something. And at some point you do have to stop and let other people read it. So that was very hard for me. And as far as the references back and forth in the book, that was very deliberate. In the talking about the book and talking about how to structure it and what should come first and second and so on, one of the things we kept running into was there really is a holistic thing where you can't fully understand thing A until you understand thing B, and you can't really fully understand thing B until you fully understand thing A. And so where do you even start? Right. And the answer, it turns out, is to just start anywhere. And then you can keep referencing back and forth and say, look, these things are related. You're not imagining it. This is all of a piece, right? Go back, go forwards. And that's, so we worked in as many of those references as we thought was necessary to fully describe each one of those situations. And you can begin at the beginning and read your way all to the end. You can do that. You don't have to flip back and forth in that way, but you're allowed to. And each thing very deliberately is explained in such a way that even if you hadn't read everything that came before, you might still be able to get enough out of it to get that reference that we're talking about.
Yeah, and trying to choose a trajectory is challenging because if you take a more anatomical or computational approach, you might start with, well, what's the smallest unit? Okay, we're going to start talking about the neuron. And once we start talking about the neuron, then we're going to talk about this, and we're going to talk about this. But we were trying to talk about the system. And so,
Can't do.
Yeah, and there wasn't a beginning and an end. It wasn't like where we began was, the assumptions of the approaches, and then trying to sort of take the computational approach and reveal its assumptions, and then show how the ecological approach and its assumptions deal with many of the challenges that you run into when you start with the computational assumptions. But there wasn't really any, it wasn't like it's more like a map than it is like a recipe, right? There aren't steps. Like we don't have to go from step A to step B. You don't have to talk about vision before you talk about audition. It just, there's this, we could have ordered a lot of the chapters differently. We could have started with social psychology. I think other people writing the same book would make that choice, and it would be a valid choice.
We
you know,
we sent out the first 4 chapters really set up the ecological approach, and we sent those chapters out actually to a number of readers to make sure they made, because those were vital, right? You got to get those 4 chapters right. And every single person we sent them to was like, well, that's not how I teach it. This is how I teach it. And that's not how I teach it. This is how I teach it. And every single one was different. So it was like, oh, I see. We really could have written that in many other ways. Well, this is the way we chose. This is how we think. So that's the one that we wrote down. But there are other ways to go at it, surely.
Yeah, I guess to tie this into the listeners that we'll probably have, they use an application called Obsidian. It's kind of like Wikipedia, but on your own computer.
Okay.
So you can create your own Wikipedia style thing. And this is what John and I are both using at the moment with notes and stuff. And we link backwards and forwards all of the time. And reading the book made me feel kind of like I was in my Obsidian, in my Wikipedia. I was like, I can just jump backwards and forwards. It's not quite the same because on my computer I can click and it goes there. Kindle, you got to do a bit of faffing. But it's nice to see a book like that, almost like you, I guess, couple the start and the end together, you know, a cycle of book. But unfortunately, books don't work like that.
Yeah.
Is there anywhere for people to get in touch with you if they do have questions?
Absolutely. They could email me. I would love to hear anybody's questions. My email address, I mean, maybe you'll put it in the link.
Yeah, I can put it in the description. That way they don't have to remember it. Jeff, is that the same for you?
sure is. Yeah, feel free to email me. Yeah, we'd love to hear your comments,
Absolutely.
especially if they're positive.
Or even if they're not, I'd like to hear, but you can send the negative ones to me. And people can buy the book on Amazon, but they can also get it on straight from the Routledge website. I think it's a little cheaper on the Routledge website. So
That brings up a question. I'm going to ask you guys this. The publisher is Routledge or Rutledge?
oh,
It's a UK company. Does it?
So
Uh-oh.
no.
at university, there was always a debate between the two, and it was never really settled. But the majority of people said Routledge. That was the way it was pronounced. But some people pronounced it in different ways. So I wouldn't say there's a right or wrong way. It's just more. It's said Routledge more from the university I was in, but I'm in the southeast. And the further north you go, or west, the more the accent changes the words. So I don't think it really matters.
Okay. Well, then I will feel free to keep calling it whatever I feel like today.
Pretty much.
I mean, as long as there's a link, people can click it. So,
yeah.
Right. See everyone next week. Well, see if they're on YouTube, if they're on podcasts. Obviously, they'll hear us next week. So, bye, everyone.